Good morning. Senator, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Professor, for your comments and detailed layout of the position of AIC and a lot of challenges in your talk this morning. I'd like to do a couple things. First of all, tamp down expectations. Professor went through this litany of greats and super greats that have addressed this audience in the past and reminded me of the anniversary of Secretary Albright's coming. I am not the secretary, and I don't want you to get too carried away, but I am grateful for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. And those thoughts, I like to think, are from the school of pragmatism, experience, and hard knocks in the field around the world and dealing with people for many decades. I might begin, and I'll tell you what I would like to do is talk, hopefully for not too long, to address the subject of this conference, and then be happy to open it up for questions, and I'll put up my shield and sword and take whatever you want to throw. Let me start, if I could, with a little personal background, and that is a little bit of a confession that I knew little about Iran, and in fact the region, the Gulf region. Growing up, I of course studied the history and did a little bit of digging here and there, but my first real introduction into the people of Iran was after I'd embarked on my professional career as in naval aviation. And I see one of my godfather mentors here, Tony Less. He's going to keep me straight here on certain aspects of the profession. But my first introduction to people that I recognized from Iran were the cadre of young aviators, pilots that were over here in the U.S. in the early 70s to learn how to fly the F-14. And we shared a common base up in, or now from here down in Virginia. So I got a chance to meet some of these guys, became pretty close to a number of them. And in my own mind, helped meeting these people and engaging with them offset something that struck me as very, very odd, and that was the decision by our government back in those days to sell F-14s to anybody, not least, most surprising, I thought, to Iran. And I guess this is fueled by my narrow base of experience to date back in the 70s, sensitive to the fact that we hadn't even deployed these aircraft in our own fleet, and we were going to send them halfway around the world in circumstances that even then I thought were probably a little bit unstable. And so, as you know, events began to unfold. If you could fast forward a couple of years, I was privileged to be a student at the Naval War College in the late 70s. And it was a difficult time for military professionals because there was an awful lot of breastbeating and agonizing over the lengthy involvement experience that we had in Vietnam and other issues. But to the enduring credit of the institution up there in Rhode Island, they chose to focus us not on things that we were quite familiar with, the Far East, Southeast Asia, Europe, NATO, the Cold War, but they put us to work learning about the North Arabian Sea, Iran in particular, Afghanistan, Southwest Asia, the Gulf region. And so we got into it. Now in those days, of course, we were allied and had a lot of connections with the Iranian military and government. And so very different reality a few years later. But we studied, and I got to learn and become quite familiar with the geography, the people, and the culture as much as one can do in a year. So a couple of years later, I found myself back in the fleet on an aircraft carrier, and we were diverted from where we thought we were going and what we were doing and told to go to the North Arabian Sea in response to the events in Tehran in '79, the hostage crisis following, and then the Iran-Iraq war. Spent an awful lot of time out there. In fact, so much time that when I returned from what I called 8 months of exile on an aircraft carrier, basically turning, did a lot of flying. I enjoyed that very much, most of it over water in circles. But that particular deployment noteworthy for about 8.5 months of time away from home and a young family for many of us, with 4 days of shore leave in Singapore, the highlight of that time. So at the end of that, I said, you know, what am I doing here? Maybe I ought to be doing something else. So I hastily drafted a note of resignation following the established format, and had sent this thing in advance back to the States. So when I landed and climbed out of my jet, I was immediately accosted by my wing commander boss back there, who said, be in my office at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. We're going to have a little talk about your future. Anyway, too much detail. But since that time, of course, we've had an awful lot of attention focused on this relationship between the U.S. and Iran, and that's what I'd like to address today. So given the political and social upheaval that's sweeping the Middle East in recent months, taking a look at Iran, and more specifically this relationship between the two countries in the context of this change, is certainly timely. The state-to-state interactions since the '79 revolution, the overthrow of the Pahlavi dynasty, has been testy, to say the least. There's lots of talk over the decades, particularly here in the U.S., about changing this adversarial and distrustful relationship. But as we all know, little modification has resulted. Yet it appears on the surface that many people in Iran retain some affection for Americans. Certainly the robust Iranian-American community here in this country fosters good relations between the peoples of both countries and spearheads initiatives aimed at reconciliation. Among the few Americans who seem to care about Iran, there's no ingrained animosity, certainly towards the Iranian people, that's apparent to me. Let me share with you a little anecdote. Back about 12, 13 years ago, my, at the time, new son-in-law embarked on a trip to South Asia to make a documentary film in his budding career. And he ended up passing through Iran. He was tracing one of the old silk routes out to China. And he got to spend some time in Tehran. And he came home and relayed many stories. One struck me as quite interesting. He was in Tehran. I'm not sure what part of the city. He pulled out a picture. And the picture was a mural that was painted on a wall, not particularly encouraging good relations or depicting what you might like to, it was a caricature of the Statue of Liberty and a skeleton encased in an American flag and flames and not very pretty. And so my son-in-law and his colleagues stopped to admire this artwork. There was a man who was busily painting this. And this gentleman turned around and he looked at them and said, "Oh, are you Americans?" And they said, "Yes, we are." I said, "Oh, well, you must know my cousin so-and-so, and he's in Los Angeles." So the boys said, "No, we don't really know him, but yes, we're Americans." And so he began to talk. And he said, "Oh, you know, we have a lot of good friends, very good friends in America." And so the fellows then kind of pointed to the wall and said, this doesn't look very friendly. And he said, "That's just my job. I love Americans." There's a message there. I don't think things are all that different in many quarters. But back to the questions today. So why is there no improvement in relations between the governments? What impact, if any, will these changes currently sweeping the region near Iran have on the relationship? What can we expect in the future? I think that many here today could tick off a long list of reasons for the lack of progress in response to the first question, and we'll touch on some of these in the discussion. Let's focus on the present and what current and recent developments might portend for the future. The uprisings and what has been popularized as the Arab Spring have shaken the established political hierarchy to its core, and in some cases, removed it. What follows remains to be seen, as the exuberance of success in the streets fades into the reality of unresolved political, economic, social, and security challenges. In Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Libya, Yemen, Syria, and other places, huge throngs of people have protested against the established order with varying degrees of success. No matter the ongoing state of play, messages of dissatisfaction with the status quo have been delivered and received in ways that were just unimaginable 6 months ago. Now, certainly there are differences in the specific issues in each of these affected countries and their neighbors in the region. But common factors include authoritarian governments, economic inequities, political discontent and repression, human rights violations, all being highlighted and communicated by the application of new technology in the form of social networking media. Now, although Iran is at the eastern extremity of these upheavals to date, the implications for governments which share elements in common with those affected to date should be obvious. In Iran, with memories of the so-called Green Revolution of 2009 still fresh, I suspect these events must be giving pause to the leadership, might be providing some kind of encouragement to the estranged in Iran. On the other hand, using the zero-sum logic characteristic of recent U.S.-Iran relations, some aspects of regional upheaval are likely being celebrated by the leadership in Tehran. No doubt sharing the discomfort on the part of the U.S. in regard to potential political and security changing relationships. Specifically, I'd cite the departure of longtime U.S. ally Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, the inconclusive yet ongoing conflict in Libya, the clumsy response in Bahrain, and the disaffection of Saudi leaders with U.S. actions in response to these populist uprisings. Returning to the question of the impasse between U.S. and Iranian relations, let's review a couple of key factors in this stalemate and then explore a potential influence of recent events in the Middle East. I think one thing worth remembering is the difference in historical perspectives between the two peoples. An Iranian society with imperial dynasties and a cultural achievement that spans millennia, and a long-standing influence and desire to be a major factor in the region. American history, notwithstanding its short but meteoric rise to prominence, is less than 3 centuries old. And its real interest in the region dates only back to World War II and subsequent. American efforts to maintain the Pahlavi dynasty, combined with long-standing conservative Persian Islamic aversion to secular influences, provided key aspects to the legitimacy of the '79 revolutionary takeover of the government by Ayatollah Khomeini. The ideology of the new regime was specifically anti-secular and anti-American as the embodiment of Western culture, encouraging revolutionary activity and even martyrdom to preserve Shia Islam, guided and guarded, really important today, still by the Supreme Ayatollah and his successors. I don't think we can begin to understand this unless we have these key perspectives in the background. This revolutionary zeal that was manifested within Iran after the revolution and carried out with support to surrogates outside the country, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Sadrists in Iraq, has been particularly distasteful to the American side. In the U.S. view, these activities have encouraged terrorism, fostered instability, undercut U.S. efforts to stabilize a region plagued with sectarian and political tension and conflict. The takeover of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, the captivity of the occupants by the Iranian students, was a particularly embarrassing episode for the U.S. Subsequent U.S. support to Iraq during the decade-long Iran-Iraq War and the tragic shoot-down of an Iranian airliner fueled continuing animosity during the 80s. Challenges and threats by Tehran against the U.S. and Israel, followed by recriminations in kind, have marked recent years, with the notable addition of the Iranian nuclear program. Ostensibly in support of alternative energy sources for Iran, the program has expanded enrichment far beyond what might be expected of a peaceful development program, and been conducted largely in secret in violation of numerous UN resolutions, all of this dramatically ratcheting up tension throughout the region. The largely economic sanctions imposed by the UN and some individual nations, mostly in response to the perception of Iranian intransigence on the nuclear issue, have undoubtedly slowed the development program, the nuclear development program, and also had an adverse economic impact on the people of Iran. The true effect of these sanctions is really difficult to judge because of Iranian internal resiliency, contravention, and offsetting assistance by non-compliant nations. Questions about the intent, extent, progress of the Iranian nuclear development has been a lightning rod and a focal point for polarizing debate in the region and around the world. What, if anything, to do about ongoing Iranian activity in the area has been a source of endless speculation and discussion. In recent months, the combination of apparent technical issues in the Iranian development program, apparently slowing these efforts, the diversion of attention throughout the region to issues related to the Arab Spring, and internal economic priorities in both countries have reduced the rhetoric and intensity of focus on this principal nexus of contention of the nuclear program. How long this central issue remains eclipsed by other factors is a good question. Not very long, I expect. With so many things happening in so many different countries, the combination of events may result in unanticipated consequences. Let's look at some specifics. The top of my list in terms of factors that are driving and will continue to drive this change are economic. Indeed, a column in this past Sunday's Washington Post by Mary Beth Sheridan reported the results of a recently completed survey in Egypt, in which Egyptians indicated support for the revolution was mainly because of their poor economic condition, not because they yearn for democracy. Now, the average Iranian citizen may be a bit better off than his Egyptian counterpart, but the economy is very big. Iran's heavily dependent on its oil sector, and that's highly inefficient by most reports. Discontent and unrest, fueled by economic concerns, have surfaced in the past, certainly. But a large public sector workforce and a demonstrably effective internal security force intolerant of dissent have mitigated against any widespread unrest. And I would think that this is probably the likely course unless there's some huge economic hit to the Iranian economy. Now, some people in the U.S. were cheering these large street demonstrations back in 2009, thinking that the discontent might topple the regime, thereby ushering in a new era of U.S.-Iranian relations. I think these hopes were fueled by extensive media hype, citing the use of this new social networking technology. But the rosy expectation for change ran into a reality of a large, effective crackdown by the government and their Bazi militia volunteers. But I think all events at that time frame also demonstrated the widespread support that the regime enjoys from key elements of Iranian society. So they're countervailing forces. Now, certainly there are fissures and fractures within the ruling elites in Iran. The recent standoff between President Ahmadinejad and the parliament over the oil ministry is a good example. These differences are internal. But a consequence of the Arab Spring is that all governments in the area are really looking closely at internal security and stability. Perhaps a second-order effect of either the competitive squabbling among elites or the overriding focus on internal security could be less focus, commitment, and priority to the nuclear program, whatever its real objective. A challenge for U.S. leaders in grappling with the Iranian problem, I believe, is a lack of understanding of the complexity of the country and the influence or lack of wielded by various elements of the society. One wonders at the interplay between the clerics, the president, his cabinet, the parliament, the Bazari, and the military. The influence of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, the guardians of the revolution, seems to be on the upswing as they permeate virtually all aspects of the society. Question, are there real differences of opinion, or are these merely shades of the same color? Who really affects decision-making? A key dynamic of U.S.-Iranian interplay has been the historically close relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv, on the one hand, and the seemingly endless stream of anti-Israel vitriol emanating from Tehran on the other. Reinforcing these verbal harangues has been a long-standing military support and training for the militants in Lebanon and Gaza by the IRGC Quds Force. A potential indirect result of change might affect relationships all around the region. The brutal crackdown on protesters in Syria, a key Iranian ally and conduit for arms and support to Hezbollah and Hamas, is yet to fully play out. Crackdown in Bahrain and the subsequent arrival of troops from Saudi Arabia and other countries certainly had a chilling impact on that activity in that country. What this portends to the future also remains to be seen. In Egypt, the new leadership helped broker a reconciliation of sorts between Palestinian factions and reopened recently key border crossing into Gaza, as well as initiating some new overtures and outreach to Tehran. Interesting development is the reported appeal by Saudi Arabia to Islamic states worldwide to close ranks in an allegiance against Iran. Motivation allegedly being dissatisfaction with U.S. support for Sunni-dominated countries and concern about the majority Shia uprising in Bahrain. If, how, and when these elements influence the U.S.-Iran relationship really remains to be seen. As previously noted, several historical factors and decades of reinforced enmity between the two countries are at work in maintaining a status quo. Occasional attempts over the years to lead the parties to a more conciliatory path have been rebuffed by one or the other. The latest, the Obama engagement initiative, which apparently has gone nowhere. The basic reality is the plethora of issues in front of both governments. For the U.S., domestic economy, the wind down of operations in Iraq, ongoing conflict in Afghanistan, relations with China, et cetera, all demand time and energy, and the Iranian relationship is not currently near the top of this list. Clearly, there are common interests in the region and the world. Improvement in relations, in my opinion, will likely occur with the realization that the interests of both people are better addressed with engagement and cooperation rather than antagonism and hostility. There is no clear path to this preferred alternative anytime soon. But the unprecedented scope of regional change may yet have a profound influence on this relationship. We shall see. With that, I'd like to end the formal monologue and open it up to whatever may be on your mind. Thank you.